So I want to say good morning because it feels like morning. I know you know. And so as Dimitri said, the title of my presentation is Who Lives? And if as I am presenting, you wonder what it is I am telling the story of or what my argument is, it always comes back to this question of who lives, both the first word and the second, not necessarily in that order. And the subtitle is A Thought Experiment Between Schrödinger and Schrödinger. A thought experiment, in German, Gedankenexperiment, sorry, translator, as a well-formulated, elaborated idea in order to try to shed light on what the situation is purely through the means of introspection or thought. And Schrödinger, as you may know, is actually much more famous for a thought experiment associated with the idea of Schrödinger's cat, this idea of a cat. He must not have liked cats, I don't know. He put a cat in his thought experiment in a chamber with some radioactive material. And there are some details to be elaborated here, but the conclusion was that the cat was neither alive nor dead, that it was in this nether realm that could not be captured by life or death. So this thought experiment is very appropriate for the topic of this symposium, insofar as it is interested in this question of the boundary and the question of the human and the question of, therefore, the living and the non-living. And I think it is significant that Schrödinger finds over and over again that, in fact, what appears to be a boundary between the living and the not living is just an appearance. Right? So this question, who lives, a thought experiment between Schrödinger and Schrödinger, is about two other thought experiments that Schrödinger engaged us in. And the first is quite well known and in many ways launched us, put us into the context of biotechnology, put us into the context where we ask this question of what can be done with a life form in artistic context. But the second one, very intriguingly, is not so well known. It is not noticed. It does not capture our imagination, perhaps, in the same way. But I hope by the end of my presentation you see that the first and the second go together as much as the living and the dead. Okay? So this question of the boundary, in order to make it something that is not just a concept that we talk about in words, I wanted to begin with this question of gratitude because I feel actual gratitude for the ocean, but also for the opportunity to speak with you today. And that if we really dwell in gratitude, we see that, once again, a boundary that is apparent, the boundary between ourselves and the other, is not actual. That the experience of gratitude itself would be impossible if the apparent distinctions between ourselves were real and palpable. Now, sometimes we can feel gratitude and we can feel those distinctions, but actual gratitude, or what in Greek gets translated as agape, total dissolution of the boundary between self and other, is really the state that I'm trying to point to if we're talking about what is the condition of the human in a non-human, extra-human, inhuman planet. The situation of the human is the situation where gratitude is possible, even where the apparent distinctions between the self and the planet are everywhere, and where those distinctions between the self and the planet transform the planet in many different kinds of ways that we will try to talk about. But before it goes to sleep, I want to point to this image to have you put it in your mind as, it went to sleep, perfect, now you can only use your mind, which is that if you want to understand a good visual for the human, thank you, agape, spasipo. If you want to have a good image for this situation of gratitude and our relationship to the earth, if you think about the crest of the waves that we are seeing back here in the ocean, that there is no division between the crest of the wave and the wave, but also yet it is distinct. And that if we need an image or an archetype for what the human is, it is this crest of this wave of a planetary intelligence seeking to know itself. So I'll try to tell you how we might come to that. So, gratitude. So, Schrödinger. We can be grateful for Schrödinger because in 1943, Schrödinger, who was an Austrian physicist who had already made his reputation and was very well known for his work in quantum mechanics, became audacious. He decided to ask a question that had not been asked. And he referred to himself as a dilettante. A dilettante is someone who just maybe jumps into an area that they don't really know about. They're an amateur. And he, with no apologies, enters into this question that he titles his lectures in 1943 in Ireland, where he had fled to during World War II. It's a very simple question, perhaps not quite as simple as who lives, but the very simple question, what is life? Question mark. And this was viewed as audacious because it is a very interesting symptom of modern human beings that they have to ask this question, that it is not immediately apparent to them what life is. And we can see that maybe this is so because 1943, two things are happening, at least. One is, of course, Schrödinger is witnessing the wide-scale destruction and thermodynamic expenditure of war. He sees enormous destruction in a context where he had not seen it before. This makes him question what exactly is this system within which I am enmeshed? Because everywhere I see not life, apparently, but non-life. The other thing that is happening, of course, is what enabled that destruction is that human beings, by 1943, had become capable of tremendous control over their external environment. Of course, compared to the control we have now, it is not so much to speak of. But compared to 50 years earlier, the difference was extraordinary. It seemed like almost, and it was spoken of in these terms, a kind of magic through technical means that allows us to manipulate the life world any way we wish to. Of course, this raises the question, how do we wish to manipulate the life world? Now, what is interesting about that is that at the time that Schrödinger is giving his presentation and the time that I am giving mine, this question, what is life, remains resistant to this capacity to manipulate and transform. And so, this is what I like to call, in our contemporary moment, and maybe why this symposium is happening and why symposia like this are happening, is the mystery quotient. And what I mean by that is that the more capacity we have to technically manipulate the material world, the more a simple question, such as, what is life, becomes an anomaly. It becomes elusive. It becomes dangerous to our perception of our ability to manipulate the world. And so it's almost as if the more capacity to manipulate we gain, the more disturbing and strange the mystery of what we are remains. And so Schrödinger we could see as being maybe near the beginning of this epoch of the mystery quotient, when the very question of what is life becomes most disturbing because it remains unanswerable. So Schrödinger, being audacious and being a physicist, then decides, as physics was doing at the time, to scale down, to get small, and to say, what is it about a living system in its fundamental qualities that I can isolate as a physicist and determine as characteristic of that living system? Now, of course, it is a bit wrong to say that Schrödinger is the first to say, what is life? Because, for example, you can go back to the books of the Bible, even Ecclesiastes, one of the books of the Bible that's snuck in there. If you read it, you see, what is it doing there? And because it is a mystery too. And the answer to that in the Bible is, of course, that life is always vanity. It's just appearance. Things come into being and go out of being. So we might even say, prior to Schrödinger, not being too careful, that the question, what is life, is equivalent to the question, what is death? Life is death. But Schrödinger, being a physicist, is looking at the system and saying, how, at the very small level, can we understand what it is that a living system is doing? And it's extraordinary because even, I believe, 6 years before pneumococcus virus was isolated and the importance of DNA began to be suspected, Schrödinger, in a thought experiment, invents the idea that contained within the living system, within a cell, is what he called a code script that contained the entire life plan, as he put it, of the organism. Or as he put it, it was both law, code, and executive power, both the law and the enforcement of the law, internal to the organism. Now, Schrödinger comes up with this probably because already in 1929, this question of information had emerged in physical practice through the work of the Hungarian physicist Leo Szilard in studying thermodynamic systems. And there are details to go into there, but what Szilard figured out was that if you hypothesized a being that could keep track of the heat of a given chamber, that by knowing where the heat was in that chamber, it could do useful work and increase order. This term came to be associated with the idea of information. And it became associated with the idea that information is physical. It's a physical quality. So Schrödinger takes this idea of information and says, living systems are a way of gathering information to better organize energy gradients. An energy gradient is just the difference between hot and cold that organisms work off of. So Schrödinger comes up with this idea of the code script 11 years before Watson and Crick, under his influence, then come up with the double helical structure of DNA. So in other words, it was a visionary idea which Schrödinger had, which arrived for Schrödinger, for which we can be grateful, which then influenced and was a kind of catalyst towards the emergence of what was then called biophysics, and then molecular biology, and then genomics, and biotechnology. So the idea of manipulating living systems on the basis of their informational structure emerges as if in a dream. In other words, emerges not in reference to any actual system, but out of a thought experiment. So that is scaling down for Schrödinger. We say, okay, who lives? Living is this capacity to engage what Schrödinger called negentropy, which is the production of order out of the environment. So living becomes something that Schrödinger thinks now can finally have a scientific basis. Perhaps the mystery has been solved. It's an extraordinary moment where many people think that, in fact, the so-called secret of life, which does not seem to be hidden from anyone, is solved. I did not know that there was a problem, but anyway. But this part of the thought experiment is very well known. So the idea of the code script then gets taken up by many different scientists. George Gamow, another Hungarian, articulates the code model of DNA. And there's a very interesting and complicated history about how we come to understand DNA and RNA as information systems, or as what later get called biosemiotic systems. But Schrödinger, being a dilettante, being someone who asks audacious questions, was not content to simply ask questions about the world as it appears. In other words, the external world that we are capable of manipulating. How can we manipulate an organism so that it produces an organism like itself? Heredity. That is the sort of external, objective, scientific question that Schrödinger is asking. But he's also asking the question of, what is life? What is it like to be alive? And today, for ourselves, this may seem like an illegitimate question, in fact, because we've become so abstracted from our actual own experience, which we call, in English anyway, subjective, which is understood in the English language now as being the absence of the objective. Whereby, even though all of us spend our entire lives, whatever those are, in the subjective. So Schrödinger turned his awareness away from the objective towards the objective, because he said to himself, if this is so, if there is a code within every cell that determines the law code and executive power of that organism, that means that I am nothing but, these are his words, a clockwork mechanism. In other words, I am essentially an android. If there is a code script, then it is the software, a later term, but a software that manifests me, and I am nothing but the manifestation of that software. And Schrödinger says this is precisely so from the objective point of view. And today we can be more sophisticated and say, well, there's a very subtle relationship between our genome, for example, and our environment, such that epigenetics tells the true story of how we unfold. But this does not really do anything about the fact that we are nonetheless, from that point of view, deterministic beings. Because whether it's in our environment or in the code script in our cell, we are nothing but the result of the interaction with those things. And I think it's important to really feel what that might mean. To not simply reject it and say that it is the fantasy of a scientist who thinks he's a robot, but to feel, what does it mean that the apparent nature of my experience, which is that I am experiencing the freedom to act and move and think and so forth, is only an appearance. But Schrödinger, being not only a scientist, but a philosopher, looked to his own experience as much as he looked to the external world. And so he sees a paradox that, on the one hand, he has produced a scientific description that says that he is nothing but a clockwork mechanism. On the other hand, he has the experience, which is the best data that he knows, his own experience, right? When he is gathering data from a physical instrument, he is working with his own experience. When he is designing an experiment, he is working with his own experience. So he does not discount his own experience. So on the one hand, objectively, he is a clockwork mechanism. On the other hand, if he will get still and experience what it is like to be himself, he realizes that he experiences total freedom, unfettered freedom. Now, we can go in philosophically and we can say, well, that's an illusion. But I think that when we say that, we once again avoid the experience. He's not saying that there is an objective reality to his experience of total freedom. He is saying that he has the experience of total freedom. So, being a physicist, he wants to make a logical synthesis of these two, of this contradiction, of being a clockwork mechanism and being total freedom. So this is the second thought experiment. And in the second thought experiment, he says, I cannot avoid the conclusion that the only way to reconcile the idea that I am at once a clockwork mechanism, the universe is a clockwork mechanism, and yet I experience total freedom, which is that I am the entire cosmos. And he draws this from the Vedanta tradition of Indian thought in the Upanishads, where this equation is summarized in the Sanskrit terms Atman, or personal self, more or less, equals Brahman, the ocean. That the apparent boundary between the personal self and not just the earth, not just the solar system, but the entire cosmos itself, expanding for 13.7 billion years, is only apparent. It's no more actual than the distinction between living and non-living that he rendered problematic in the Schrödinger's cat experiment, and the distinction between physical systems and living systems that he rendered problematic in his treatment of what is life. So I wanted to bring to you this second thought experiment today, who lives, right? Because this is the question that Schrödinger is asking, because he has asked what living is, what is life, but then he does not forget to ask the follow-up question, which is, who is living it? Where is the bounded being who is living it? And if we will take our own awareness and really ask that question, we see that each apparent boundary that contains where the living would take place, we say, okay, I am not an isolated being because I have a microbiome. I am more bacteria by dry weight than I am human cells, fortunately. They didn't check that at the border. Yes, yes, soon. And I can say, okay, but also concept of the biosphere. In fact, if any of us were isolated, even for a moment, from the living surface of the planet, we would immediately perish. Each of us requires 300 to 500 plants, even if we were in a small chamber, to produce sufficient oxygen for us to inhale. So out there right now, there are trees that are part of you in a palpable sense. Your interior forms a tree structure in your lungs. Those lungs are in a fractal relationship with the tree. The apparent boundary between your lungs and the tree is only apparent. So Schrödinger finds this through direct experience of his own mind, through the mystical tradition of the Upanishads. But I was particularly happy to come when I received this invitation to speak here, because then there is a scientific concept that I don't believe Schrödinger was aware of that was happening around the same time. It's very interesting that it seems to emerge to 3 different people at the same time. One is Vladimir Vernadsky, who was born in St. Petersburg and comes up with this idea again during a war, World War I. He is looking and seeing the rail cars go by to supply the troops, and he asks himself, what is pushing those railroad cars? And of course it was coal. You could say, well, it was coal, or it was oil. But Vernadsky was a geophysicist, so he thought about things in planetary terms. He says, yes, coal, but what is making the coal come out of the ground? Labor. Yes, but what is making the labor push it out of the ground? And he follows this along to this idea of Noösphere, or the conscious layer of the biosphere, that aspect of the biosphere that can focus attention on itself. And so I want to suggest to you today that when it comes to bioart and the condition of the human, that this concept of the biosphere is enormously timely. Because we are asking this question about what is possible with living systems when we create bioart. We're asking this question of what is possible with living systems when we ponder the boundary between the human and the non-human world. But I think many times we dwell on the level of the material, of matter, and we forget that just as we are connected between our lungs and our trees, it is the activity of our thoughts and our attention on the biosphere. It is the effect of knowing the biosphere that is leading us to this moment right now. And so this concept of the Noösphere as the way for evolution to slowly begin to know itself is a concept that I want to enter into this conversation, because from that context, then, human beings are the crest of this wave of an attempt by the cosmos to know itself through energy gradients, and we are part of an evolutionary system, not separate from it. Now, human beings are aware that they are aware, so we are a part of this crest of this wave, but plants are engaged in the Noösphere. Flowers are attention attractors for insects. Bacteria are engaged with the Noösphere as they glow in order to transduce information from one to the other. The Noösphere is not a human entity. Humans participate in the Noösphere. So when we ask this question, who lives? We not only lose the boundary of where living and non-living is for individual human beings, we gain the encounter with our evolutionary entanglement, right? So I'll close with Darwin, the last paragraph of The Origin of Species, and notice just the phrasing, because Darwin, of course, is one of the beings, along with Lamarck and Darwin's grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, by which we began to know that we were involved in an evolutionary system. And he closes Origin of Species, which hardly anyone reads this book. I encourage you to read this book. It's actually not about what people say it's about. And he says, it is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank. By an entangled bank, he means a river that has plants and flowers and birds and insects flitting about, he says, and is this sense of being entangled that is true of us not only in the biological level, but on the level from which I even now speak. So who lives is not an individual entity, but the cosmos itself. Thank you.